So what we wanted to do is move on to the next component that I know Glen is really passionate about this, and that is, what skills are required. What's the DNA of a sourcer? What sort of things does a sourcer really need to have to be able to deliver compelling results?
Well, this is one that I feel like I have some insight into, certainly, but I don't think anyone will ever fully solve it. And of course, probably the number one challenge is figuring out how to assess whether or not people have the skills required to do the job. But it's a really good question, because when you use the word skill, you're actually thinking about something that someone already has. And in my experience, the people that I've been able to train that turned into people that have the strongest sourcing capability were people that had no prior research experience, which of course is confusing to some people, because you would like to find somebody who has already demonstrated something in their background that leads them towards research. But research in general, if you really try to find out why would somebody be interested in research or sourcing, and for me, I boiled it down to a couple of things that are kind of obvious and a few that are not. Number one is critical thinking. Number two is problem-solving capability. But more important than that is actually enjoying solving problems. I'm sure everybody on this call has actually worked for, perhaps had people work for them that are excuse-oriented. You work on something for a period of time, you can't get the desired result, and at that point they give up. A person who's going to be good at sourcing is somebody who never gives up. Failure is not an option. And I look at that as a trait in myself, as well as a trait that and not a skill, but a trait that you can hire for in people that tend to become very good at sourcing, is that no matter how many roadblocks they run into, or how many times they fail, or how much difficulty they run into identifying the right person, they simply never give up. And I'm sure people on the call that are either top sourcers themselves or know other people, I would be surprised if they didn't have that trait. And that actually ties into a competitive nature. And of course, you can start to interview people for this. I would like to think that part of the reason why I don't give up when I take a difficult assignment, or if I get a new position that seems to be incredibly difficult for a skill set I've never heard of before, it's really that competitive nature that I think is really kicking in to try to figure out that I will not fail, I won't lose. And losing for me is failing to show up with highly qualified candidates. I like to tell people, and it's a fact, although the people that work for me don't like to hear it, is that I never have failed to show up with qualified candidates for any job, no matter how difficult. And I just take it as a personal challenge that I don't back down to. So the competitive nature is important. Of course, some analytical capability, although if I look back at how I got into sourcing and recruiting, I had a Bachelor's of Arts degree, so a non-technical degree in psychology. And although some people might say, oh, okay, that makes sense, it's not really an analytical profession as far as I'm concerned, unless you're talking about, analyzing emotional aspects of, human nature. It certainly wasn't data focused. So I would say the problem-solving piece is huge, but here's one that I to this day, some people think I'm crazy for saying it, but I think people that have a slightly obsessive personality do incredibly well in sourcing. Again, whether it's a dedicated role, like all they do is source candidates, or if it's a recruiter who is relied upon to be a very good sourcer. And the reason why I say that is because other people they'll use terms like that person is driven or they're focused. And the reality is, beneath that all, and perhaps that is my psychology degree coming through, is that it's an obsessive nature. And I don't mean obsessive in a bad way. I mean in that focused, driven way. If you look at any athlete or top musician, the only reason why they're a top athlete or top musician is because they're obsessed with being the best at what they do. And I think that people that have that trait, that are always driven to, if they're in a team of 10 people, they have to have the best numbers. I was one of those people, and I try to hire people that have that trait. Even if they haven't come from sourcing or recruiting or human resources, I actually could care less about what experience they have prior to coming to me. I just need the right person on the inside, because the rest can be trained. Those traits that you're hiring for, they cannot be trained, and you will never make someone into a great sourcer. You can train someone who already has those internal characteristics to use those traits to become a good sourcer, but I don't think that you can change somebody's basic DNA. So I hope that gives you some insight into how I would answer, what is the DNA of a good sourcer.
No, thank you for Glen. Glen, that was a great answer. One of the things that I'm a bit curious of, like in terms of sourcing, like have you seen in terms of your sources who like they've got really good sourcing skills and they also have really good candidate engagement skills, or do you see that that's a different skill set and generally a source that doesn't have the good engagement candidate engagement skills? What's your experience around that?
I love that question because there are many people who think that you have two types of people. Typers, right, the ones who click away on the keys and run the searches to find the people, and talkers, people that can either do phone sourcing or the candidate engagement piece. And I have to tell you, I've never been just a sourcer. And most people in my organization are responsible for sourcing their own candidates that they engage, then recruit and hire. So there is no right or wrong answer. Certainly there is significant value in an organization depending on the scale and depending on the types of skills you're looking for. Because I would argue certain organizations and companies don't need sourcers. It's foreign to me because I look for professionals in the information technology space and they're never enough. You're always having to find them. You post a job and you don't get enough people. There are some industries, lower level industries, looking for example, customer service or things like that where you'll get a flood of responses, and amongst those you might actually have the right, you might find enough people. So certain organizations don't need a dedicated sourcer. But back to directly answering the question, I find that it's simply a matter of getting the right person who has the right DNA, as we just discussed, to be able to find the answer, and the answer is enough people that are either a direct match for the position or people that will eventually lead you to the people who will be able to fill the position. But in my experience, we actually in my firm do have a small team of people and all they do is source, but the majority of my experience is training people to do both. And so I don't think it's an either or, although I have to admit, certainly there are people in the world who are not very good at engaging other people socially, and that's fine. They may be very good at the research portion, which is great, but I don't like the generalization that you're either a typer or a talker, because not only am I both, I've worked with hundreds of people who are just as good at both. And in fact, I think it's critical, because if you know the position you're looking for, you know how to hunt the right person, and you also know what they're going to be potentially interested in, which goes back to what we talked about earlier. How do you engage a candidate? And to Joe's point, these people are very sophisticated now. They're approached by recruiters very often, and in many cases they simply won't even return a phone call or an email. But the reason why they would is if you know enough about that person based on your research to know that they actually would be interested in your opportunity. But again, that takes some sourcing skill, and then of course the candidate engagement to be able to explain that. Because, and I'll tell you something interesting, one of our major competitors recently posted a resume online, and it was a in-demand skill set, and that resume got over 100 phone calls in 1 week. So how do you think a person who may or may not be actively looking, do you think they could possibly return 100 phone calls? Do you think they'd even be interested in that? And the reason why I mentioned that little study or experiment is because the difference between a person who gets through that candidate is the person who's good at engagement, at understanding what will make that person respond. And it's always going to come down to the relevance of the match between the opportunity and that person's experience is what I found. So I don't think it's an either or. I know that's a long answer, but this is something I'm very passionate about. It can be an either or, but I've found that it very often isn't. People can be just as good at both.
Thanks, Glen. I think, like you said, it really comes down to the person, and I think I totally agree with you. If they've got really good sourcing skills and they've got really good engagement skills, then they go actually hand in hand, and it actually allows them to, I think, get a better outcome rather than someone else doing the engaging versus the sourcing. So I totally agree with you. What we wanted to talk a little bit now about is the future of sourcing. And I know this is kind of looking into the crystal ball, but I think there's some really interesting things happening in the market now. If you look at the technology that we now have at our fingertips, it's changed significantly over recent times, and I think the social web now is starting to play a huge role in terms of sourcing engagement of candidates, and finding out. You can pretty much find out anything online. About potential candidates. I'm just interested, Glenn, in your thoughts around, LinkedIn, for example. I actually see that LinkedIn's kind of, now that they're IPO, they're kind of, the money, I think, is becoming more important to them, and I can kind of see them moving more towards like a job board sort of environment. Whereas if you look at Facebook, I think Facebook are now starting to give you the ability as a potential candidate to start to put professional information in there, and it keeps separate, what you do on Friday night to what you do on Monday morning. I'm just, interested in your thoughts in terms of, the future of sourcing, where, all these LinkedIns and Facebooks and Twitters, and what is the future? What do you think is going to happen over the next 12 months, 18 months around sourcing and the tools that we have and so on? Another big question, I know.
Yeah, no, I love them. It's something that I and many people, I'm sure, have thought about for a while. It's why doesn't Facebook have a more professional angle to it? Obviously people think of it first and foremost as simply social. If you talk to people, even people who are in sourcing and recruiting, and they use it primarily for friends and family. And I do think that Facebook has a huge opportunity because they're obviously the single largest repository of information on people on the planet that I'm aware of. The problem is, though, that a lot of users don't think of it. And honestly, this is also your recent college graduates. I've seen some polls done of recent college grads that do not want to put anything professional related, even if it was in a separate area. So I'm not saying Facebook won't be able to pull it off. It's a great idea, and it would be certainly a good way for them to monetize. Of course, then they could also turn down the path of LinkedIn. Some people are looking at LinkedIn just the way you mentioned. They're starting to monetize, and people don't like that. But they are a business, and you have to give them credit for seeing this many, many years ago and being able to move in that direction with the model that they have. And I know for certain they have many other things that are going to be coming out that companies will be interested in and willing to pay for. The Facebook issue that troubles them is not only getting their own users to think of putting in professional information, and will they ever trust Facebook to keep their personal from their professional truly separate? Facebook has done a lot of stupid things, in my opinion, over the years with regard to privacy. Hopefully they can get a better track record and get people to trust them, again, because it would be fantastic to leverage it. There are people that put information like titles and employers on Facebook. It's actually ridiculously hard to search. It is somewhat searchable, but I actually have worked with a recruiter at a very large organization, and they called Facebook block, essentially, not because it was actually blocked, which many companies do block access to it. It's just the fact that it's so difficult to write anything other than the most basic single keyword or title search, which is going back to my 5 levels of talent mining. That's the most rudimentary way of leveraging information. Certainly it works, but you have some challenges there. Now, on the LinkedIn front, of course, what it has going for it is that many people, not recruiters, the people we look for, do think of it as the professional community. They're more comfortable using it to put their information on there. LinkedIn made some really good moves in terms of their, create a resume or a CV from your LinkedIn profile. Definitely saw that coming. I'm sure many people did. Now you're going to be able to eventually apply online directly from LinkedIn. I also will tell you that, think of this, and some of you may have already, but this fascinates me. There are companies from which they can learn more about their current employees by looking and analyzing LinkedIn than they can their own systems. And that's true. I've spoken to companies for which it's true, but it doesn't take much of a stretch of the imagination to realize that some large companies can actually learn more about their employees by looking at LinkedIn than looking at whatever information they keep on them internally in their own system. In fact, some people are leveraging LinkedIn to try to figure out who might be at risk at leaving. Because part of, the whole recruiting life cycle starts with discovery and identification, which is the sourcing piece. And then, of course, you engage, and then you engage and attract, and then, of course, you acquire. But the other part is retention. And what some people are starting to do to leverage information is look at LinkedIn activity as indicators of someone maybe wanting to leave. And, of course, if you can retain your talent, you may not have to source as much, if you're not having to stem the flow of people leaving your organization. So that is definitely very much a part of what LinkedIn is going to offer companies in the near future.